think everybody on this on these screens has met me sometime or other, someplace or other. I, along with Ann Kimball, am one of the two priest associates at St. Michael and All Angels. And here we are in this wonderful season of Lent, spending our time thinking about the way our faith has influenced the way we've led our lives. And tonight, what we're going to do is talk a little bit about two members of this parish, one of them corporate lawyer type character, and the other a banker, and ask them to talk about how they got into their fields and how God's leading played a part in what it is that they did. I should tell you that I'm particularly interested in this because these are two folks who spent their life in the world of business. And as some of you know, besides serving God, I serve Mammon as an advisor to senior execs in a variety of different kinds of places, including back with God, some bishops and cathedral deans and the like of that. But the thing that really strikes me is that my career pretty much has been about high performance people by accident, I suppose, but the parishes that I've served by and large, and the companies that I've served, and the organizations that I've been, have been full of people who are really high performers. And what I've noticed is that the ones who strike me as being extraordinary leaders and having rich careers, as I've gotten to know them, I've discovered how frequently, most of the time, their faith, however they define that faith, is a powerful influence in what has happened and what has brought them to the places where they are. So we'll spend some time first with Jonathan Dean and then with Lee Cooper. And I'm going to let them tell you what they feel is best for them to tell you about their lives from the point of view of how our faith affects the work that we do. And I'm hoping that as they talk, you will spend some time thinking not just about their careers, but about your own and your sense of the role at various points in your career that your faith has been a big factor. So that when we get to a time when everybody gets unmuted, you all can have a chance to weigh in, not just on what you heard from our two presenters, but also what you heard from your own heart. So with no more ado, Jonathan, would you lead us off, talk a bit about how you got in your career and where your faith has found itself?
Yeah, I would be delighted to. The nice thing about the kind of questions you've asked us, Doug, is it's really pushed me into thinking back through where I have been and where I've gotten. I had my father was a very complex guy with a lot of problems, very bright guy. He was a Christian. He definitely wanted me to become a lawyer. He also wanted me to become a politician, which never happened, but he did want me to become a lawyer, and he instilled that in me over the years, and it had a huge influence on me. I had extraordinary good fortune in terms of where I went to school. I've only recently realized really how positive that experience was. I went to a wonderful Episcopalian boarding school, which is why I'm an Episcopalian, and there were two sides to that. One was we had daily chapel as well as communion every Sunday. And in the course of 4 years, I had heard a huge chunk of the Bible read out loud, and I'd heard almost all the Psalms in the wonderful Cranmer translations that we were using in those days. And those things stayed in my head and remain in my head today. the school also, because it was not so much for people like me, it was for the children of the elite. And there were sort of two messages. One is you're likely to inherit a lot of money. You should make sure you use that for the benefit of everybody, because that's what you're called upon to do as a Christian, and you're likely to be a leader, and you need to lead people in a positive way. And one could not help but hear those things. The teachers taught us critical thinking. They taught us to question anything we're told and to try to think things through for ourselves. And that is very helpful in terms of bringing oneself to faith. Then I had the equally good fortune to go to Harvard, where people also felt, well, my gosh, we probably got in by mistake, but since we're here, we're going to be leaders and we need to be responsible. I had four wonderful teachers. I majored in medieval intellectual history, so I was really steeped in the history of Christianity.
Jonathan, excuse me, can you speak up a little? It's hard to hear you.
I'm sorry. Yes, the mic on my computer is not very strong, and I need to get closer to it. I apologize. Four wonderful teachers: Giles Constable, who taught the history of monasticism in the Middle Ages, who made these people who founded the different monastic orders real to us. My tutor was Caroline Bynum, an extraordinary mind. Her first book was called Jesus as Mother, The History of Spirituality in the Middle Ages. And she won one of the first MacArthur scholarships for it. Extraordinary person. Also, Benjamin Schwartz, who taught the intellectual history of China and made Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism alive to us. And then the other thing was sitting down by myself and reading William James, The Varieties of Religious Experience. I don't think William James was a Christian, but his book said when people's religious experiences are real, and that had a huge impact on me. And thereafter, and echoing what one of the people in our class today, who I see is not in this group now, said, my wife was an extraordinary biblical teacher, and she really knew the Bible, and she was extraordinarily helpful to me. And when she taught the Bible, she never told you what it said. She asked you what you thought it said. So throughout this, I was given the Bible, I was told to think for myself, and that, I think, led me to where I am. And this has continued to today, where these Zoom meetings I have with the parish have gotten me close to people I would not have been close to before, and I'm continuing to have the same kind of learning from them. So following my father, I did go into law. I went into, after a few years in a firm, a large American industrial company, Goodyear. And then for 10 years, I was at another large American company, a company called Eaton Corporation. I didn't know what I was getting into. Socially, the people were very old-fashioned. They were a long way from where we are today in terms of how they spoke of women and minorities, but they really cared about their people. They cared about the company as an institution. One of the things that struck me again and again was, if they had worked, as many of them had, in one of our plants or two of our plants, they had an emotional attachment to those plants, to the role of those plants in the community, to the people who worked in those plants, to the families those people were supporting. They did not ever want to think about shutting one of those plants down. They saw the company as an institution that served not just the shareholders, but also the employees, the customers. For us, it was very important to make our dealers successful. We would not be successful unless our dealers were successful. We had plants, and the business strategy that was developed in the days when there were protective tariffs all over the world. And in order to deal with that, we had small plants in countries all over the world, primarily serving those countries. And again, each plant employed a rather highly paid, highly expert workforce, most of whom were probably supporting an entire village somewhere that they came from. We had plants when I started in the Philippines, in Malaysia, in Indonesia, in Japan, in Thailand, in India, and I had the good fortune to visit, of course, all of those places over the years. My primary project in business was starting up a new joint venture plant in Dalian, China. And it was absolutely fascinating because the people in Dalian had purchased a radial tire plant in Sweden that had gone out of business. And they bought the whole plant, lock, stock, and barrel. They sent a team up there with acetylene torches who cut the equipment up, put it on a ship, brought it to Dalian, China, reassembled it, welded it back together, and had no idea how to operate it. And it was sitting there unused. And we came and we formed a joint venture with them, and we hired people. We got the place up and running. It was not, we sold in the style of our company. We sold the tires we made almost entirely to original equipment companies, that is auto companies in China, primarily Volkswagen, in fact. And we hired an entire new workforce. And it was interesting, in Dalian, unlike many parts of China, there was a tradition of women working in manufacturing. There were, for some reason, in Dalian, a lot of very tall, strong women who were eager to work in manufacturing and able to handle the jobs. Again, many of the people were supporting a whole village. We went from a place that was employing essentially nobody to a thriving place that was full of people. And this was all about people. The people I worked with absolutely cared about people. Our job was to employ people, and we balanced the different interest groups that because of course, as we all know, corporations exist by the largesse of the legislature that says, yes, corporations, people can get together, get money together and form corporations, but of course, they support not just the shareholders, not just the management, but also the workforce and the customers and the communities in which they function. And that's what was part of business when I was in business. It was wonderful, and I found it totally fulfilling. And I found the people, when I got used to the fact that they were a little old-fashioned, particularly in how they talked, I really came to completely respect them and loved working with them. Now, that's when I left Goodyear, which was now 15 years ago. I worked 10 years at another company in Cleveland. Since that time, there have been some changes that I will just briefly comment on because we need to work beyond them. In China, China has gone from a country where there was just a huge resurgence of individual entrepreneurship and political freedom back to, under Mr. Xi, a authoritarian government and a pushing of the economy back to the state-owned industries. This is not good. It will not be good for China. It's not good for people. In the United States, what we've seen is a huge resurgence of the influence of the people the finance people, and the power of the shareholders, the large institutional shareholders, and very short-term planning, because what the financial press looks for is what your predictions are for the next quarter and how close you come to them. So we've gone from where we planned when I started out for 10 years out to planning for 1, 2, and 3/4 ahead, and a huge influence, a huge shift away from focusing on rewarding the workers, particularly in the industrial workers in the plant, to the shareholders and the senior management. And indeed, there was a really interesting article in the latest edition of the corporate law part of the ABA about how dangerous that is. So, but my experience was completely positive, and it was a joy. So, Lee, I turn to you.
Before you do that, one quick question for you. It sounds as if the early part of your career, you felt that your faith and your work were pretty aligned, that you were able to live out the values that you thought you'd learned in Christianity, and that there was a lot to make you feel that by doing what the enterprise wanted you to do, you were also being faithful to your Lord. And that as time went on, that wasn't quite so true.
Yes, but during most of my career, I felt it was true. Um, for example, Goodyear hated the idea of shutting a plant down. They looked to China primarily to supply tires for the Chinese market and to keep the American plants going. Yes, we moved away from quite the same focus on people on the line. There was a thought, oh, we don't really need people, we can use robots. But all the same, when I left industry, American industry was still focused on people, and I felt it was working there was still consistent with my faith. I'm not sure where it is today.
Lee.
Okay, thank you. You know, from our Christian education forums, we have learned, I think, that we all have stories to tell about our experiences. And we ask ourselves, is there a thread that runs through these stories? Now, here's a favorite cartoon character who's had lots of experiences. Maybe you recognize this fellow here. He's had lots of stories, lots of opinions based on those stories. He's developed wisdom from these experiences, such as this one about faith, where he has learned, as I've said here at the bottom, maybe you can't read it. Anyway, he says, faith is holding on tight when the going gets windy. Now, I'll have more to say about faith shortly, but first, a couple of things about my background. My father was a banker and a farmer in Henderson County, Kentucky, where I grew up from birth in 1938 to 1957, when I graduated from high school. I spent many weekends on the farm and some summers there. And I noticed that there was a culture to farming. That culture was work, generally 6 days a week, all day long. There was uncertainty because you didn't know whether this year's crops were going to develop like last year's. How was the livestock going to develop? So farmers saved and invested in their farm. That's what they knew. They went to church on Sunday. They worked, they saved, they watched sports on Sunday afternoon. They're in constant contact with the land and their livestock. There was an attitude in farming of kindness and gentleness. That's what I grew up with in the beginning. How about banking? I found banking decades ago to have a culture also. Attention to detail, courtesy toward others, trying to help others accomplish their goals. Think about that now. How often do we see that? Helping somebody else accomplish their goals. I attended a boys' prep school for 3 years in high school, and my education improved, better teachers, church on Sunday, visiting chaplains from other boys' schools or colleges in the East, good speakers for kids to hear, not boring. In our chapel, we had flags hanging down from the ceiling of most of the nations in the United Nations. It was an impressive place to be in and to hear those talks. I went to Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, majored in economics and finance, went from there to Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley for an MBA. I started reading the Daily Wall Street Journal as a sophomore at Miami, and that continues to this day. I attended Episcopal Church in college. After Berkeley, we moved to Hinsdale, Illinois, and I began work at the Northern Trust Company in Chicago. One Sunday at the Episcopal Church in Hinsdale, we had a visiting minister from Toronto, and he quoted from two poems from an Anglican priest named Reverend G.A. Studdard Kennedy. He was a priest during the First World War in Britain. And they called him Woodbine Willie. And the reason they called him that is because he was a front lines guy. And he would crawl along these foxholes with these soldiers, and he would pass out chocolates and some kind of British cigarette that they call Woodbines. They didn't like the Woodbines very much, but that's all they had. But that's what they called him Woodbine Willie, crawling around those foxholes. World War I was a dirty war. It was a bloody war. If you look back on it, that's what we'll find. Now, he wrote a poem which he entitled Faith. Remember, this guy here has this little cartoon. Faith is holding onto that tree when the going gets windy. His first poem, Faith, is 2 pages long, and I'm not going to go over that whole poem. I'm going to read you the first 6 lines and the last 6. Well, this is a guy in the front lines fighting for the British, the fellow soldiers. Here's how he begins it. How do I know that God is good? Now remember, this is my first job out of graduate school. How do I know that God is good? I don't, he said. I gamble like a man. I bet my life on one side in life's great war. I must. I can't stand out. I must take sides. The man who is neutral in this fight is not a man. His bulk and body without breath, cold leg of lamb without minced sauce. He's a fool. Makes me sick. Good Lord, weak tea, cold slops. He says, I want to live out, not wobble through my life somehow, and then into the dark. I must have God. This life's too dull without. Now he closes that poem of faith with these lines. So through the clouds of Calvary, there shines his face. And I believe that evil dies and God lives on, loves on, conquers all. All war must end in peace. These clouds are lies, for God is love. Such is my faith, and such are my reasons for it. And I find them strong enough. You want to argue? Well, I can't. It's a choice. I chose the Christ. I choose the Christ. Now, then he wrote another poem. This one is not in a free verse format. It's less than half a page, 3 stanzas. It's called Indifference. Beautiful end rhyme, perfect rhyme and meter. Let me read this to you. I think you'll like it. But again, this was written during the World War I period. When Jesus came to Golgotha, they hanged him on a tree. They drove great nails through hands and feet and made a Calvary. They crowned him with a crown of thorns. Red were his wounds and deep. But those were crude and cruel days, and human flesh was cheap. When Jesus came to Birmingham, he's talking about Birmingham, England, they simply passed him by. They never heard a hair of him. They only let him die. For men had grown more tender, and they wouldn't give him pain. They only passed down the street and left him in the rain. So Jesus cried, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And still it rained, the wintry rain that drenched him through and through. The crowds went home and left the streets without a soul to see. And Jesus crouched against a wall and cried for Calvary. I sat there in that Sunday service, and these two poems changed my life. I've had these poems with me ever since then. I simply could not sit on the fence. I took a side for Christ. Now, since we remained Episcopalians, we still attended a non-denominational church for 20 years in Evansville, where I learned the Bible, joined the Catholic Church for a period of about 8 years, and since coming to Sanibel, I've been at St. Michael's. I'll recall one ongoing example of how faith played a role in my daily work experience. Banking from 1968 to 2000, that was a period of 32 years, I became CEO of a bank holding company in Indiana from the 1980s until I retired in 2000. In the mid-80s, the banking law changed, allowing us to acquire banks across county lines and eventually across state lines. Our previous CEO, my boss, the guy who was instrumental in allowing me to become eventually CEO, did not want the law to change. He didn't want anything to change. And he said to me, you run the bank, I'll take care of any merger acquisition stuff that we have to deal with. And he told the board that. He told the board, this law is not going to change. And we had a couple of lobbyists, and we were paying those lobbyists to try to make sure that for Indiana, that law did not change. Well, the law did change. My friend, former CEO, retired. He had a problem with alcohol. He retired, drifted on. I'd been running the bank. I knew nothing about acquiring banks. Our board said, okay, Lee, let's buy some banks. We want to get larger. So from 1985 to 2000, we acquired banks. We went from about $500 million in size to $9 billion. I soon learned that acquiring banks, you do your due diligence, but when you finally close the deal, you're never 100% certain that you've got all the facts. What might we have missed? As we would near a closing point for each bank that we acquired, and we acquired a bunch, I would be dressed and ready to go to work. I would kneel in our bathroom, my hands on the bathroom counter. And I would say, Lord, if you don't want us to buy this bank, if we shouldn't, then you stop this transaction. Or let us know enough facts so that we stop it. I didn't really equivocate with him at all. I said, if you don't want us to buy it, you got to stop it. We may not be smart enough to stop it. But I trusted God to keep us out of trouble. And he did. Now, those were windy times, but I had something tight to hang on to, and that something was faith. Now, our bank went on and became one of the largest in the state of Indiana. We went on the New York Stock Exchange. Dick Grosso, who later went into some disfavor over some disbursement plans there. He was chairman of the New York Stock Exchange. He became a friend of mine. He started the New York Stock Exchange as a guy running on the floor in 1968, which is exactly when I started in Indiana. My parents influenced my faith and ethics. While in high school, I would be seated in the den with my dad watching a football game or something, and my dad would go in the other room. He'd bring in a multi-column spreadsheet, and he'd sit there in a big red wingback chair, and I'd sit on the edge of the couch. He'd put the spreadsheet out over his legs, and there were our investments. Now remember, this is a banker and a farmer, so he'd saved and invested and invest the difference in common stocks. We didn't have a lot. This is what we had. And he would show me what we had. Number of shares, cost basis, how much dividend it paid, when was the dividend, he'd talk about the companies, the GEs, the Exxons, the AT&T, and so on. And he would always say to me, he'd look at me and say, this was hard to come by. And I've heard that line many times from his lips over the years. This was hard to come by. Those are words from a farmer whose dad died when his father was 35. My dad was the oldest of 3 children. He was a sophomore in Center College, Kentucky. As soon as his dad died, he dropped out of college immediately, went back to work on the farm, and helped support his mother and his younger brother and sister. They went on, one went to Princeton, one went to the University of Chicago. That's what people did back then. You were the older one, you supported the family. You got busy and you worked. So you talk about stocks. What's that really got to do with faith and ethics? Well, I think about that, and I think my dad sat there and talked, father and son. I could see and feel his ethics as he discussed companies and management and leadership. My mother would come in from the kitchen, a family. That's how I grew up. Now, after all of that, many of you are familiar with the story of one solitary life. You're familiar with this, but I want to just go over it. It's one page. It's one solitary life. It's the author is unknown. It goes like this. Here's a man who was born in an obscure village, the child of a peasant woman. He grew up in another obscure village. He worked in a carpenter shop until he was 30, and then for 3 years, he was an itinerant preacher. He never wrote a book. He never held an office. He never owned a home. He never set foot inside a big city. He never traveled 200 miles from the place where he was born. He had no credentials but himself. Now, while still a young man, tide of popular opinion turned against him. His friends ran away. One of them denied him, turned him over to his enemies. He went through the mockery of a trial. He was nailed on a cross between 2 thieves. His executioners gambled for the only piece of property he had on earth when he was dying, and that was his coat. When he was dead, he was taken down and laid in a borrowed grave through the pity of a friend. 1900 centuries have come and gone, and today he's the centerpiece of the human race and the leader of progress. I am far within the mark when I say that all the armies that ever marched, all the navies that were ever built, and all the parliaments that ever sat, and all the kings that ever reigned, put together, have not affected the life of man upon this earth as powerfully as that one solitary life. I would like to think, as I look back over my life, that there is a thread that runs through that life, and that is hanging on to the tunic or the clothes of Jesus Christ. And that has affected as much as I can, without just getting in the way of it, of my ethics, my faith, and my business. Doug?
Thank you, Lee. If you were to just in a brief sentence describe your sense of your call as a banker, well, how would you describe that call?
Well, I always felt like our job as bankers were to try to help others accomplish their goals. Service was our most important line of business. We used to say that, had that on a little card. But my job was to get all the loans and deposits in the city or in the county or in the state or in the country, if I could. But in so doing, we wanted to help you individually accomplish your goals. We want to know what those goals were and wanted to work with you to get that done. We wanted to be honest about it. I'd say that was pretty much it.
Jonathan, same question to you. What is your sense of your calling? Unmute. There you go.
Okay. I think it was to do what I could for the employees who worked in the plants and in the field, building tires and selling tires at Eaton, building transmissions and selling and servicing transmissions. Um, it was to try to help make things happen that benefited those people. And that's what happened, somewhat to my astonishment. I was able to do that. So I thought that was my call, that was my responsibility to care. Even though I didn't know those people, I knew that what we were doing was permitting them to have families, and indeed to have houses and a boat. Typically, I mean, it was and to send their children to college. That was my calling. That was what my job was to do.
I have one last question for both of you, and that is, do you have any memories of your faith intruding on your work?
Well, I can give you one that comes right to mind. I grew up in Henderson, Kentucky, which was a rural community, and I worked, as I said, on farms and construction work, and I worked with what we call colored people, blacks, all my life. My best friend in high school was a black guy. And so I never really thought much about racism or race growing up. And then I got to a point when I first got to Evansville, I was a trust investment officer and I was head of the trust committee, which was not in this high position at all. But anyway, once a month we would have an investment committee meeting, and that included some directors. And one director proceeded to consistently tell racial stories and stories putting down the poor, but particularly putting down blacks. And when he did that, I thought of particular blacks that I'd known in my work experience in my life. And I thought, I'm not going to do this. So I went to my boss, who was the president of the bank, and I said, we are really busy. Why don't I join you guys after lunch? Then I'll chair the meeting, but you go ahead and have lunch. Well, he looked at me kind of strange, but anyway, we did that for a while. And then finally, he said, I want you to come back and have lunch with us. So I looked at him, he looked at me. I went back and we had lunch, and there were never any more racial stories told. So that was a case where I really thought when I said, I'll chair the meeting, I'm not gonna have lunch with you, I thought he might fire me. And if he had, that'd been fine with me. I felt that strongly about it.
How about you, Jonathan?
My experiences are the same, but I was not as brave as Lee. I kept my mouth shut, but I was troubled by that kind of talking. And I worked for 2 years for an extremely intelligent guy who was very difficult. One of the things he would do is when I'd come in the morning, he would challenge me. And the one I remember so strongly is I come in the morning, I'm there on time. He joked later that I was the only guy I ever had worked for him who came in on time. And of course, we started early. And he would say things to me like, Jonathan, name one really great woman conductor. Name just one. And I didn't know what to say. And one of my colleagues was married to an Italian woman who looked very dark. I remember him saying to his boss, I think we have a problem here. I think he's married to somebody who's using a bad word for black people. I didn't know what to say about those kinds of things. I didn't know what to do about them. I ended up keeping my mouth shut. but it was very troubling. And my hat goes off to Lee and his gutsiness.
Thank you both. Lots of time for the rest of you folks to pitch in, questions, comments, or testimony out of your own experience. So wave a hand, or you'll find there's a hand you can raise down at the bottom by clicking on it. Looks like this, and if you just push on it, that'll show up. And we'll see if we can spot them. Susie's watching, so.
Well, I'll start. I just want to thank you both. That was really interesting. And I just wanted to share this with Jonathan. The two most influential people in my professional life are Giles Constable and Caroline Bynum. So Giles Constable is a good friend of mine. He died just two weeks ago or so. And he's visited me here on Sanibel. And Caroline was the director of my dissertation and the most influential person on my dissertation. So I just thought that was a funny coincidence. But I learned from both of them actually a lot about how to interact with people and how to behave. Not that I ever was good enough when I knew them to really live up to it, but they were wonderful examples for me that I, kind of internalized the lessons. And one of the most important things was just to understand, how important it is to reach out to people who are less powerful than you are, or who are not as far advanced as you are, and to give them a hand up. And they both were incredible at that. Particularly Giles was absolutely marvelous that way. He was so supportive of everybody in his, in his circle of people. And, he entertained people. He brought them into the group. He introduced people to each other. He put me in touch with this person and that person to work on similar interests. And it was really admirable. And so I learned a lot from them.
Oh,
It's a small world. Constable is somebody who I always looked up to as well. So.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, he did know everybody. He was incredibly influential.
Yeah.
And he was totally gracious with everybody. Absolutely.
Totally gracious. Yes. In fact, he came to visit me on Sanibel, and we were walking around in the Bailey tract. And he sat down and he said, you'll have to excuse me. I'm just a little bit upset. My daughter is in the hospital with a terminal cancer diagnosis, and she's being operated on at this moment. And I'm like, Giles, why didn't you say something? He was just so gracious. He didn't even think to interrupt our walk or anything. It was terrible. But anyway.
Attila?
Thank you all very much for the really, really great and insightful presentations that you gave. And I have a question for both of you, because obviously, your presentation has been a little bit backward oriented. That's what it was, because we are all retired. So we are tending to dwell on, what we've done, what we've accomplished, not accomplished, and what guided our way. I would like for both of you to now comment on the situation that we see in the industry today, industry in manufacturing and industry in the banking industry. And I'd like to see how you all feel about it, and what you would like to have promoted, or what you would like to promote, to make some of the issues that we see a little more in line with our Christian faith. Thank you.
Okay, Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Well, as I started to say at the end, what I've seen happen in recent years, and even more since I left, particularly since I left Goodyear, but in manufacturing, is a total focus on shareholder value rather than on compensation of the other stakeholders. And the suggestion that was proposed in an article I read yesterday, actually, in the ABA corporate journal, was to change the compensation committees that determine compensation, who tend to focus almost entirely on compensation of senior executives, particularly the chief executive officer, of course, who's pleasing whom is very important to everybody who works in the company. And away from that, because what's happened is compensation for senior executives has actually moved from salary to stock. And as it's moved to stock, that goes along with the power of institutional investors who are pushing for increase in value of stock, particularly short-term stock increases, because institutional investors don't hold the stock very long. They want to see it go up and then change hands and to sell it to somebody else. To get the compensation committees to look at what is the way of properly compensating the people who work for the company, and then balancing into that the customers, the dealers. The power of finance and the power of the institutional investors is completely out of hand right now, and I think it's a major problem both for companies and for society as a whole.
If I may, Jonathan, I totally agree with you, and let me give you an example of where I came from. The company that I used to work for, we had a golden rule, and that rule was that the executives of the company should not make more in 1 year than an average worker of the company makes in a lifetime. So that means, compensation of executives maximum should be between 30 and 40 times annual salary of a skilled worker in the company. Today, if you look at it, it's in the neighborhood of between 300 and 500 times.
Crazy. And when you were running that company, I think you were doing the right thing. In Japan, it's not so far from that. And Lee, what do you have to add to this?
Lee.
I think what you say, Jonathan, is right. I'm in a little different position right here. I find myself the last couple of years in a position of advising our grandkids, if you can believe that, and their spouses or their boyfriends who are in their first job or thinking about school and so forth. And as far as they're concerned, I tend to take the view that the more things change, the more they tend to stay the same. We've always had issues. As far as they're concerned, I want them to go to graduate school if they can. I want them to know that they have to work hard and that they have to have an idea, a sense of knowing what's going on around them. That's why I say, read the Wall Street Journal and get the hard copy. And when you get it, put section A down and go to section B. That's business and finance. And that's what individual companies are doing. And that's where you find out what's going on. So these other issues are out there, have to be dealt with. But as far as dealing with them, if you're young and you have a career ahead of you, I still think getting education and working hard and knowing what's going on is the way to go.
May I pin you a little bit, Lee, and just re-ask, what would you do or suggest to put more ethics, ethical values, Christianity back into business?
Well, I think that's a great question, and I can go back to my career. Again, we were small potatoes compared to the kinds of companies we're talking right now. But I think ethics in companies starts at the top. It starts at the board level, it starts at the CEO. And not just to do a me thing, but I would talk to all of our new employees and tell them what kind of a business we were. And first thing, if you're in banking, your only inventory is money. So it's easy to steal from a bank, but you can't steal it for very long. So I would tell them to be honest. You're going to be tempted to steal. Don't do it. But it starts at the top. And I look at GE and what's happened to GE. And I think that didn't start with Jeffrey Immelt. It started at the board level. The board kind of went to sleep with it. Didn't ask enough hard questions.
One thing that I've been observing myself is that there are an awful lot of people in the workforce who don't seem to have a real sense of purpose, except to get along and get ahead. And what that seems to do is take away from them their courage. So there's a lot of folks that I spend time with struggling really hard to decide when is it worth it to point out the things that are going on that are less than positive. That well, I can remember an incredible thing. This is going back a bunch of years, and it's going back to Ragu Spaghetti. And I was doing a bunch of work for Ragu, and there was a brilliant woman who was one of the 6 senior people who reported to the chief executive officer. And I mention this one because it's nasty and it's not unusual. And what would happen is they would have a staff meeting every week with the CEO, and she was the only woman on that senior group, and they would talk before they went in, and they would raise issues that really needed to be addressed. They get into the room, she would raise them, and the rest of them would act as if they'd never heard the thing before in their lives. It just let her twist in the wind. And she had no idea what was going on. I said, look, I've seen this all too often. That's what we guys will do to women if we're given half a chance, and it's just wrong. I said, if they want to speak up about an issue, you tell them to get strong, get in there and do it themselves. And if they ever raise something again, and you raised it, and you don't hear from any of them, better confront them right in the middle of the room. So there's a lot of sabotage that goes on these days, and I think it comes out of a place of fear. And it worries me, and I do think it has an awful lot to do with what we began to see in the late 70s and early 80s. And that was, there's just an awful lot of formation of people from a value standpoint that wasn't going on. It just wasn't happening. And I think we're reaping the whirlwind of that now in many occasions. So I'm glad, Lee, you're talking to your grandkids. They need a vision, and they need courage. I want to thank you very much for presenting tonight. For me, the series this year and the last couple of years have been so inspiring, because what's been going on is different members of this parish standing up in front of the rest of us and giving your testimony to your life and faith. And it is a wonderful thing to see. So thank you, those of you who did it tonight and those who have done it before.
Well, thank you all very much for coming. We're flattered.
Listening.
Thank you. It was very
Thank you.
interesting.
Talk to this group, to be part of this group.
Good night, one and all.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night, Doug.
Good night.